There is a moment, just before the sun fully rises over the hills of south-central Kentucky, when the world seems to hold its breath. The mist moves slowly across the meadows, drifting between the old oaks and the cedar trees, settling low against the earth like something alive and quiet. The rolling hills are green, soft, and still. Birdsong begins faint at first, a single call, then another, and the sky shifts from deep blue to the pale silver of early morning. Dew sits on the grass. The air smells of limestone and wet leaves and the particular sweetness of Kentucky soil after a cool night. It looks, in these first hours, like any stretch of peaceful countryside, fields and forests and winding roads, old farmhouses with their lights just beginning to glow. The kind of place where time moves gently and where the land seems settled and known and familiar, but beneath it, beneath all of it, is something else entirely. Beneath these meadows and forests and quiet hills, the earth opens. It opens in ways that do not announce themselves. It opens in long, dark corridors carved by water and time, in vast chambers where no sunlight has ever reached, in underground rivers that have been flowing in total darkness for longer than any human memory can reach. Beneath the grass, beneath the roots, beneath the limestone bedrock itself, there is a world enormous, silent, ancient, and still largely unknown. This is Mammoth Cave, the longest known cave system on Earth. More than 400 miles of mapped passages wind through the rock beneath Warren, Edmonson, and Hart counties in Kentucky. More than 400 miles, and yet researchers, explorers, and scientists who have spent their careers studying this system will tell you, with quiet certainty, that the mapped portion is almost certainly not the whole of it, not by a long measure. How much of this underground world still remains unseen? That question has no certain answer. And in that uncertainty lives something deeply compelling, a reminder that even in a world mapped by satellites and measured by instruments of extraordinary precision, there are places that have not yet been fully known. Places that hold their secrets patiently in the dark, beneath the ordinary surface of an ordinary-looking landscape. Welcome to history's sleepy time. Tonight, we are going underground, slowly and carefully, and with great curiosity. We are going to follow the water that carved these passages. We are going to walk, at least in imagination, beside the ancient people who first descended into this darkness thousands of years ago. We are going to meet the explorers and scientists who have devoted their lives to understanding what lies beneath Kentucky. And we are going to sit quietly with the questions that remain unanswered, as the dripping water and the still air and the deep silence of Mammoth Cave ask us, gently, to keep wondering. Before we go any further, if you are watching this for the first time or returning after a long day, we would love it if you would take just a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment wherever you are watching from tonight, whether it is a small town in Kentucky or a city far away or somewhere in the world that surprises us entirely. We always love to know. Now let us descend. The entrance to Mammoth Cave is not dramatic. That may be the first surprising thing about it. You walk along a wooded trail and the trees arch overhead, and there is the sound of birds and wind. And then the ground begins to slope. The air changes, it grows cooler and more still, and the smell of stone and deep earth comes forward. The light begins to dim. The trees are thin. And then ahead of you, the limestone opens like a mouth in the hillside, wide, shadowed, breathing cool air onto your face, and you understand that you are standing at the edge of something very old. You step inside. The birdsong fades. The morning light retreats. The world above closes behind you gradually, the way sleep closes over a restless mind slowly, then completely. And you are in the dark, not quite in the dark, not yet. Your eyes adjust. The entrance corridor is wide, and the stone is pale and grey and faintly luminous, and the ceiling arches high above you in a way that feels almost architectural, as though something with great patience and great skill shaped it from the inside. You go deeper. The air is 54 degrees Fahrenheit, steady, unchanging, the same in January as in July. The silence is not complete. There is the sound of water somewhere, always, the soft percussion of droplets falling from limestone onto stone, the faint, distant murmur of moving water far below. And there are echoes. Everything you say comes back to you, softened and shifted, as though the cave itself is quietly repeating your words. You go deeper still, and the question that began above ground, how much of this remains unseen, follows you down. It settles around you, comfortable and unhurried, in the cool, dark air. We are going to spend a long time underground tonight. There is no rush. To understand Mammoth Cave, you must first understand the stone it lives inside. Limestone. The word is simple and familiar, but the substance is remarkable, and the story of how limestone comes to exist is one of the longest stories geology has to tell. More than 300 million years ago, the land that would one day become Kentucky lay beneath a shallow inland sea. It was a warm sea, close to the equator, filled with creatures, corals and crinoids and shellfish and ancient mollusks, organisms whose names would mean nothing to the casual listener, but whose presence was immensely important. These creatures lived and died in vast numbers over millions of years. Their shells and skeletons, made largely of calcium carbonate, fell to the seafloor when they died, layer by layer, year by year, century by century. They accumulated in deposits of staggering depth and density. Over time, unimaginable spans of time, those accumulated shells were compressed by the weight of more sediment above them. The sea retreated, the land rose, and what had been the floor of an ancient ocean became rock, dense, pale, grey-white rock, limestone. This is the foundation of Mammoth Cave. The rock itself is the record of an ocean that no longer exists. Every wall you touch inside that cave is, in a very real sense, made of ancient life. The compressed and mineralized remains of organisms that swam and crawled and drifted in a sea that covered Kentucky before there was anything that could be called Kentucky. But limestone, for all its density and apparent permanence, has a particular vulnerability. It dissolves. Not quickly, nothing in geology happens quickly by human standards, but steadily, inevitably, over time. When rainwater falls through the atmosphere, it absorbs a small amount of carbon dioxide. When it then moves through the soil, it picks up more, combining with organic acids produced by roots and microorganisms. By the time this water reaches the limestone below, it has become mildly acidic, a weak solution of carbonic acid, gentle but persistent. And carbonic acid dissolves calcium carbonate. drop by drop, year by year, over millions of years, that slightly acidic water found its way into the cracks and joints and bedding plains of the limestone beneath Kentucky. It widened those cracks. It dissolved the rock along natural fractures. It followed the paths of least resistance, down, always down, and where it moved, it left space behind. Empty space, void, passage. This is karst topography, a term geologists use for landscapes shaped by the dissolution of soluble rock beneath the surface. And the landscape above Mammoth Cave is one of the most remarkable karst landscapes in North America. If you fly over this part of Kentucky or look at a detailed topographic map of the region, something catches your eye immediately. The surface is dimpled, pocked, irregular. Round depressions appear everywhere, scattered across the fields and forests like the marks left by raindrops in soft earth. These are sinkholes, places where the underground dissolution of limestone has progressed to the point where the surface above collapses or settles downward. Some sinkholes are small, barely noticeable, a shallow bowl in the grass, perhaps a meter or two across. Others are larger, dramatic, steep-sided depressions many meters wide and deep, sometimes holding water, sometimes thick with vegetation that thrives in the shelter and moisture. Farmers in this part of Kentucky have learned to work around them. They are simply part of the landscape here. They are ordinary, but they are not ordinary. Each sinkhole is a window, or at least a suggestion of a window, into what lies below. Water that falls on the surface flows toward these depressions and disappears into them, draining underground through cracks and conduits, entering the karst system below and continuing its slow, dissolving work. The sinkholes and the cave below are connected. They are part of the same long, ongoing conversation between water and stone. The Green River, which flows at the surface through this region of Kentucky, is part of this conversation too. Underground streams and rivers within the Mammoth Cave system drain, ultimately, toward the Green River. The hydrology, the movement of water through and beneath this landscape, is extraordinarily complex, and scientists are still working to understand its full extent and connections. What they know is this: the limestone beneath Warren, Edmonson, and Hart counties is riddled with passages, chambers, tunnels, vertical shafts, and rooms of every conceivable shape and size. The cave system that has been mapped so far, more than 400 miles of it, formed over roughly 10 million years of water moving through rock, dissolving and carving and shaping, retreating and advancing as the regional water table changed with the climate and the slow tilting and erosion of the landscape. 10 million years. It is difficult to hold that number in the mind without the mind going quiet. 10 million years of dripping water. 10 million years of slow dissolution. 10 million years of darkness and stone and the patient, indifferent work of chemistry on rock. The passages within Mammoth Cave formed at different levels, corresponding to different positions of the water table in the past. The highest, oldest passages are now dry. The water table has dropped away below them over geological time, leaving behind corridors of air and silence where rivers once flowed. Lower passages are still active, still carrying water, still being shaped. And between these levels, connecting them, are vertical shafts, some narrow, some dozens of meters across. where water pours downward from one level to the next, wearing the rock smooth and depositing minerals in delicate formations as it falls. Those formations, the speleothems, to use the scientific term, are another of limestone's gifts to the underground world. As the slightly acidic water moves through rock, it dissolves calcium carbonate. When it emerges into an air-filled cave passage, some of that carbon dioxide escapes, and the dissolved minerals precipitate out, redepositing as calcite. This is how stalactites form, hanging from ceilings in long, slow-growing points. How stalagmites grow upward from floors. How flowstone spreads across surfaces in pale, rippling sheets. How cave pearls form in shallow pools. How delicate cave popcorn clusters on walls. How gypsum, a different mineral, deposited by different processes, grows in crystals and flowers and curling formations of extraordinary beauty. Mammoth Cave is not the most decorated cave in terms of speleothems. Some sections are remarkably plain, their passages carved in simple, clean limestone without much ornamentation. But other sections hold formations of genuine beauty, pale curtains of flowstone, clusters of white calcite crystals, delicate gypsum flowers that have grown millimeter by millimeter over thousands of years. Every formation in the cave is a record of the conditions that prevailed when it was deposited, the temperature, the humidity, the chemistry of the water, the rate of flow. Speleothems, when scientists date them and analyze their chemical composition, become archives of past climate, records of ancient droughts and wet periods, of ice ages and warm intervals, of changes in vegetation above ground that affected the carbon dioxide dissolved in rainwater below. The cave remembers things that the surface landscape has long since forgotten. You could spend a lifetime studying the geology of Mammoth Cave and still find questions worth asking. Many people have. Deep within the cave system, there is a river. It has been called Echo River, and the name is apt because in the right sections of the cave, sound behaves in ways that surprise you. Your voice returns to you from directions you do not expect. The sound of water seems to come from ahead of you, and then from behind, and then from below, and you realize that you cannot quite locate its source with any certainty. Echo River is a real waterway, a genuine underground stream that flows through the lower levels of the Mammoth Cave system. In the 19th century, before the water table in this region was affected by regional water use and changes in the landscape, Echo River was deep enough to be navigated by small boat. Early cave guides would row visitors through its passages by lamplight, the ceiling arching just above the water's surface, the dark water perfectly clear and still, the silence broken only by the soft sound of oars and the drip of water from above. Imagine that journey. A small wooden boat, barely wide enough for 2 or 3 people. A lamp held at the prow, casting a warm, unsteady light on the pale limestone walls and the black surface of the water. The ceiling so close that you could reach up and touch it. The air cool and heavy and still, and below the boat, seen through the perfectly transparent water, the pale shapes of the cave floor, the shadows of blind fish moving in the depths. The guides who navigated Echo River in the 1800s knew these passages intimately. They knew where the ceiling dropped and where it rose. They knew the currents, they knew the sounds. Some of them had spent more hours underground than most people spend outdoors in a year. And they carried the knowledge of the cave in them, the way a sailor carries the knowledge of the sea, not in books, but in the body, in memory and attention and long familiarity. We will return to those guides in a later chapter. But for now, the water. Water made Mammoth Cave, not in a moment, not in a dramatic event, but in the long, patient way that water makes everything it makes, by going where it can, dissolving what it touches, and never quite stopping. The cave system we know today is the accumulated record of millions of years of water, finding its way downward through limestone, following fractures and joints, widening them, carving them, merging separate passages into larger ones, diverting around obstacles. Always responding to the pull of gravity and the slow shifts in the regional water table. The underground streams that still flow through the lower levels of Mammoth Cave are the active part of this story, the part that is still being written. They carry water that fell as rain somewhere on the surface, entered the karst system through sinkholes or through the soil, and has been moving underground for days or weeks, or sometimes much longer, working its way toward the Green River. Along the way, that water is still dissolving rock, still carving, still shaping passages that do not yet exist, or rather, passages so small that no human body could enter them, which are being ever so slowly widened by the chemistry of moving water. In 1,000,000 years, there may be passages in this cave system that are large enough to walk through, passages that today are barely visible cracks in the stone. Beyond Echo River, the cave system extends in directions and depths that are difficult to convey without resorting to maps and numbers, and even then the numbers are hard to make vivid. 400 miles. That is roughly the distance from Louisville, Kentucky, to the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, laid out as a winding, three-dimensional maze beneath the ground. The passages range from enormous, rooms large enough to contain a city block, with ceilings 50 or 60 feet overhead, to narrow crawlways barely wide enough for a human body, where exploration requires patience and the willingness to move inches at a time through cold, wet stone. Some of the great chambers in Mammoth Cave have names that reflect the imaginations of the people who first entered them. The Rotunda is a vast, dome-shaped room near the entrance, one of the first major chambers visitors encounter on guided tour, its ceiling arching overhead in a great pale vault, its floor broad and level. Mammoth Dome is deeper in a vertical shaft of astonishing dimensions, its walls spiraling upward to a ceiling nearly 60 meters above the floor, water stains marking the levels at which the water table stood in past ages. Chief City is another, a long, broad avenue of a passage, its ceiling high and its floor relatively flat, with the feeling of a great indoor boulevard stripped of everything but stone. And there are passages with no names at all. Sections that have been entered and noted, but not fully surveyed. Connections between known passages that were suspected for years before anyone confirmed them. Rooms that wait in the dark, unchanged, untouched, simply existing in the way that stone and air exist, without needing to be known. The natural acoustics of certain chambers in Mammoth Cave have been remarked upon since the earliest days of recorded exploration. Sound behaves strangely underground. Hard surfaces reflect it rather than absorbing it. The geometry of irregular limestone chambers creates unexpected patterns of echo and resonance, sounds that seem to come from nowhere, that multiply and overlap, that travel farther than they should. In some passages, a whisper carries to a surprising distance. In others, a loud voice seems to vanish almost immediately, swallowed by the complexity of the rock. Early visitors to the cave often commented on this. The way the cave seemed to speak back to them, or to carry voices from unseen directions, or to produce sounds that had no obvious source. These acoustic properties would later figure in stories and folklore about the cave, as we will explore in a later chapter. But they are, at their root, simply physics, the behavior of sound waves in a complex, highly reflective environment. The ecosystems that exist within Mammoth Cave are another subject worth pausing on, even briefly here, because they are genuinely remarkable, and we will return to them in more depth later in our journey. Life has found ways to persist in this environment of permanent darkness, constant temperature, and very limited food supply. The cave is not in the biological sense isolated from the surface above it. Groundwater carries organic material in. Bats roost in the cave entrance zones, and their guano feeds entire communities of cave organisms. But it is profoundly different from any surface environment, and the creatures that live here have adapted to its particular demands in ways that are sometimes startling. Blind fish swim in the underground streams. Cave crayfish, pale and eyeless, move along the stream beds. Delicate cave spiders and crickets inhabit the twilight zones near the entrances. Rare insects and isopods occupy deeper passages. And microscopic life, bacteria and other microorganisms, exists in the cave environment in communities that scientists are only beginning to understand, some of which may have significance beyond the cave itself. Many passages within Mammoth Cave remain unmapped. This is worth saying clearly because it is sometimes misunderstood. The cave is not unmapped because anyone is hiding it, or because access is deliberately restricted for reasons of secrecy. It remains incompletely mapped because it is immense, because many passages are flooded or physically inaccessible without specialized equipment, because some sections are genuinely dangerous, with unstable ceilings, sudden drops, or flooding risks, and because the work of cave surveying is painstaking, slow, and physically demanding. Cave survey teams, often volunteers from caving organizations, work passage by passage, station by station, measuring distances and angles and recording what they find, building up the map one careful increment at a time. That work is ongoing. New connections are found. New passages are confirmed. The map grows slowly year by year, and the question persists, quiet and patient and compelling, how much more is there, waiting in the dark, beneath the green hills of Kentucky? This is a good place to pause and breathe before we move into a different kind of darkness, not the geological darkness of stone and water, but the human darkness of ancient time. Because this cave, vast and ancient as it is, was not always empty of people. Long before there were surveys or maps or guided tour, before there were lanterns or electric lights, or even the rough tallow candles of the 19th century, human beings came here. They came with fire, they came with purpose, and they went deep. There is a footprint in Mammoth Cave, not a recent one, not the print of a hiking boot or a rubber-soled shoe. This is an ancient footprint, pressed into the soft clay of a cave passage floor by a human foot, bare and deliberate, thousands of years ago. It has survived in the darkness, undisturbed, preserved by the cave's constant temperature and humidity, waiting in a passage where no daylight has ever reached. It is one of the most quietly astonishing things the cave holds. Archaeologists who have studied Mammoth Cave know that it was not simply a natural feature that human beings discovered and occasionally visited out of curiosity. The evidence suggests something more purposeful, more sustained, and more complex than casual exploration. People came here over many generations, across a span of thousands of years, and they came with intention. The earliest evidence of human presence in Mammoth Cave dates to roughly 4,000 years ago, though some researchers believe the cave may have been visited even earlier. During the Paleo-Indian period that followed the last ice age, when the first peoples moved through the interior of North America in small mobile groups, following the large animals they hunted and learning the landscapes they moved through. Direct, securely dated evidence from that earliest period within the cave itself is limited, and archaeologists are careful to distinguish between what the evidence clearly shows and what remains possible but unconfirmed. What the evidence does clearly show is this: by the Archaic period, a broad span of time running roughly from 10,000 to 3,000 years ago, during which indigenous peoples in eastern North America developed increasingly sophisticated ways of living from the land, people were entering Mammoth Cave, and they were not merely standing at the entrance, peering into the dark. They were going deep. How do we know this? Because they carried fire with them, and fire leaves traces. Burned cane torches have been recovered from passages well inside the cave system, sections far removed from any natural light. These torches, made from river cane, are among the most evocative objects that archaeology has produced from this site. River cane, a tall, hollow-stemmed grass that grows in the bottomlands of the southeastern United States, burns steadily and provides a reasonable light. Someone cut this cane, bundled it, carried it to the cave entrance, lit it, and walked into the dark with it burning in their hand. They did not do this accidentally. They planned it. They prepared for it. They knew before they descended that the cave would be dark and that they would need light to see by. They had either been here before or had been told about it by others who had. The decision to enter a deep cave with a torch is not an impulsive act. It is a considered one, made by someone who understood what they were undertaking. Radiocarbon dating of some of the torch and fire materials recovered from the cave has confirmed ages of several thousand years. The specific dates vary by location and context, and archaeological research in the cave continues. But the broad picture is well established. People were conducting underground activities in Mammoth Cave during the Archaic and woodland periods of prehistoric North America, spanning from roughly 4,000 to perhaps 2,000 years ago or more. And what were they doing there? The evidence suggests several activities, and it is worth being specific about each of them. Mining. This is perhaps the most striking and well-documented activity. Deep within the cave, in passages far from the entrance, archaeologists have found evidence of systematic mining of minerals, particularly gypsum and mirabilite, both of which are evaporite minerals that form deposits on cave walls and floors. Gypsum, which we know today primarily as the material used in drywall and plaster, was collected from the cave in substantial quantities by ancient visitors. The mining areas show clear signs of organized work, scratches on the rock where mineral deposits were scraped off, stone and shell tools left behind, wooden implements, scattered evidence of fires built for light, discarded torch materials, the debris of sustained, purposeful activity carried out by people who knew what they were looking for and knew how to collect it. Why did they want gypsum? Archaeologists believe it was likely used as a pigment. White gypsum has been used in various cultures as a body paint or ceremonial colorant, and possibly for other purposes that are not fully understood. Mirabilite, another mineral collected from the cave, has a bitter taste and may have had medicinal or ritual uses. The people mining these substances clearly valued them enough to go to considerable effort and risk to obtain them. And there is risk in going deep into Mammoth Cave with only a cane torch for light. The passages are complex. The darkness is total when the torch goes out. The cave is cold. Some passages require crawling, climbing, or navigating narrow gaps. A person who became lost or whose torch failed in a deep passage would be in a genuinely dangerous situation. These ancient miners understood the risks and accepted them. That speaks to how important the cave's resources were to them. Beyond the physical evidence of mining, there is evidence of movement, of travel through the cave that seems to have been more than purely utilitarian. Ancient footprints have been found in the clay floors of passages, preserved in the unchanging environment of the cave interior. Some of these prints are adult, some are smaller, possibly the prints of younger people, perhaps those learning the cave's passages from elders who knew them well. The prints suggest people moving through the cave with purpose and familiarity, not random wandering. There are also traces of what may have been more deliberate marks, places where the cave walls show signs of ancient human contact, smudges of carbon from torches, possible markings that may or may not have been intentional. The interpretation of such traces requires great care. Not every mark is a message, and not every smudge is symbolic, but their presence, taken together with everything else the archaeology shows, suggests that the relationship between these ancient people and this cave was not simple or superficial. It is important to be clear about what archaeology can and cannot tell us. It can tell us that people were here. It can tell us approximately when. It can tell us something about what they were doing based on the physical traces they left. What it cannot tell us, what it has no direct means of recovering, is what the cave meant to them, what they felt as they moved through its passages, what they thought about the darkness, the silence, the strange echoes, the underground rivers. Whether they feared it, revered it, treated it as a practical resource, or all of these things at once. For those questions, we must turn to a different kind of evidence. Not archaeological objects, but living traditions, the oral histories and ceremonial knowledge that indigenous peoples have preserved and continue to preserve across generations. Before we enter this chapter, a note on how to listen to what follows. The traditions we are about to discuss are not legends in the dismissive sense, stories made up to explain what people did not understand. They are living cultural knowledge, carried across generations by peoples who have maintained their identities, their languages, and their relationships to this landscape through centuries of extraordinary difficulty. They deserve to be heard with respect, not as curiosities, not as colorful embellishments to an otherwise factual story, and not as evidence for or against any particular historical or scientific claim. They deserve to be heard as what they are, the ways in which human communities have understood their relationship to the world, including the underground world, across long stretches of time. Different nations preserved different traditions. This is essential to say clearly and to hold on to throughout this chapter. The Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Osage, and other peoples who have historical connections to the region we now call Kentucky, each have their own distinct traditions, languages, and ways of understanding the world. They are not interchangeable. Their traditions are not variations on a single story. To speak of them as though they shared one common mythological framework would be inaccurate and disrespectful. What we can do carefully and with appropriate humility is note some broad themes that appear in various indigenous traditions from this region of North America, and consider how those themes might speak to the human experience of underground landscapes like Mammoth Cave. Caves in many indigenous traditions of eastern and central North America are understood as places of transition, thresholds between the world of the living and other realms of existence. This understanding takes different forms in different traditions, and no single description can encompass them all. But the idea that the underground is not simply a physical space, that it carries significance beyond its geology, that it is a place where the ordinary rules of the surface world do not quite apply, appears in many cultural contexts across this region. The Cherokee people, whose ancestral homelands encompassed large portions of the southern Appalachian region and extended into what is now Tennessee, and the surrounding states maintained traditions that included an understanding of the underworld as a real and significant realm, not in a purely metaphorical sense, but as a dimension of existence with its own inhabitants, its own rules, and its own importance in the structure of the cosmos. In Cherokee cosmology, as scholars including anthropologist James Mooney documented in his late 19th century work with Cherokee communities, the world had multiple layers: an upper world, the present world, and an underworld, and the boundaries between them were not entirely fixed. Water in particular, rivers, lakes, and springs, served as points of connection between these realms. A cave, in such a framework, could be understood as a passage, a place where the surface world opened into something deeper and different. Not a frightening opening necessarily, but a significant one, a place that required awareness, respect, and proper conduct. The Shawnee people who lived for significant periods in what is now Kentucky and Ohio, and who, like all native nations in this region, were eventually displaced westward by the expansion of American settlement in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, also maintain traditions involving the significance of underground and subterranean spaces. Shawnee cosmological traditions, as documented by various anthropologists and as shared by Shawnee community members themselves, include an understanding of a layered universe in which different realms are inhabited by different kinds of beings, and in which certain locations on the landscape serve as points of connection between those realms. It is worth pausing here to be very clear about something. We do not know and should not claim to know whether the specific cave we are discussing, the cave now called Mammoth Cave, was understood by any particular indigenous nation as a sacred site in any specific ceremonial sense. Some scholars have suggested connections between the archaeological evidence of ancient cave use and broader indigenous understandings of underground spaces as significant. Those suggestions are thoughtful and worth considering, but they remain interpretations, not established facts. The archaeological evidence tells us people were here. What the place meant to them spiritually or ceremonially is not something the archaeological record can determine with certainty. What we can say with considerable confidence is that caves appear in the oral traditions and ceremonial knowledge of multiple indigenous nations in this region as places of importance, places that were not entered carelessly, that were associated with particular kinds of experience or knowledge, and that were understood as part of a landscape that was meaningful in ways that went beyond the purely practical. Emergent stories, accounts of how a people came to inhabit the present world by ascending from a world below, appear in various forms across North America. Though they are more commonly associated with peoples of the American Southwest, such as the Hopi and other Pueblo nations, than with peoples of the eastern woodlands, it would be inaccurate to suggest that eastern woodland peoples uniformly held emergence traditions centered on caves. Their cosmological frameworks were distinct and should not be mapped onto one another carelessly. But the broader theme of the underground as a place of origin, of passage, of transformation is not unique to any one tradition. It appears in many forms, in many cultures around the world. And it is not difficult to understand why. Caves are genuinely extraordinary environments. They are dark, they are cool, they sound different, they smell different, they behave differently from the surface world in ways that are immediately and viscerally apparent. A person entering a deep cave for the first time, even today with electric lights and modern equipment, often describes a feeling of entering another world, a sensation of crossing a threshold, of leaving something behind, of being in a place that operates by different rules. For people moving through cave passages by the light of a burning cane torch, their world limited to the small sphere of flickering orange light around them, the darkness absolute, and pressing just beyond it, the sounds of the cave returning their footsteps as soft, shapeless echoes. That sensation must have been immeasurably more powerful. What they made of it, what framework of understanding they brought to it, what stories they told afterward, those are things we cannot know with certainty, but we can be certain that the experience was profound. And we can honor the fact that the peoples who came to this place carried that experience home with them, and that it became part of how they understood the world. There is also the matter of what happened to these peoples and their relationships to this landscape over the centuries that followed. By the time European American settlers began entering Kentucky in significant numbers in the late 18th century, the political geography of the region had changed enormously. The Cherokee had been pushed southward, the Shawnee had been pressed north and west. Other nations who had lived in or passed through this region, the Chickasaw, the Creek, various groups of what had once been larger confederacies, were in the midst of the long, devastating process of displacement that would eventually remove most indigenous peoples from the eastern United States entirely. When early American explorers and settlers first entered Mammoth Cave, they found evidence of its ancient human use: the torches, the mining debris, the footprints, but they often did not know what to make of it. And the peoples whose ancestors had left those traces were no longer present to explain. The oral traditions that might have connected the archaeological evidence to living cultural knowledge were separated from the physical site by distance and displacement. That separation is itself a historical fact worth acknowledging, a quiet, significant loss that runs alongside the geological and archaeological story of Mammoth Cave. Today, descendant communities of the peoples who have historical connections to this landscape maintain their traditions and their relationships to the land, even at a distance. Consultation with tribal historic preservation offices is part of the management of Mammoth Cave National Park. And the archaeological materials found in the cave are treated not simply as scientific specimens, but as the heritage of living communities, communities whose connection to this place did not end when their ancestors were displaced from it. The cave holds their echo too. In the early 19th century, Mammoth Cave was beginning to become known to the wider world, and the story of how it became known is inseparable from the story of one remarkable man. His name was Stephen Bishop. Stephen Bishop was born into slavery. The specific year of his birth is not certain, but it is generally placed around 1820. He was enslaved by Franklin Gorin, a lawyer and landowner who purchased Mammoth Cave and the surrounding property in 1838. Gorin recognized the cave's potential as a tourist attraction. It had been drawing curious visitors since at least the early 1800s, and he assigned Stephen Bishop as a cave guide. What happened next changed the understanding of Mammoth Cave permanently. Bishop took to the cave with a combination of physical courage, spatial intelligence, and what can only be described as a deep and genuine passion for exploration. He was not simply showing visitors the passages that were already known. He was pushing beyond them, crossing underground rivers, descending into unexplored sections, mapping in his mind the complex geography of the cave in a way that no one before him had managed. In 1838 or 1839, Bishop made one of the most significant discoveries in the cave's recorded history. He crossed what was then considered an impassable barrier, an underground river crossing that earlier visitors had turned back from, and found that the cave continued on the other side. What had seemed like an end was, in fact, a beginning. Beyond that river crossing lay miles of additional passage, entire chambers and corridors that no recorded explorer had ever entered. Bishop crossed on a ladder he improvised from materials available to him at the time. On the other side, he found what we now call the new entrance areas of the cave, a discovery that immediately and dramatically expanded the known extent of the system. He continued exploring. He found Echo River, which we have already discussed. He found Mammoth Dome, that great vertical shaft of astonishing height. He found passage after passage, chamber after chamber, in a sustained campaign of exploration that lasted years and that mapped the cave more thoroughly than anyone had managed before. And he drew a map. Stephen Bishop's map of Mammoth Cave, produced from memory and personal exploration, without the benefit of surveying instruments or formal cartographic training, is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of American exploration. It was drawn sometime around 1842, and it was accurate enough that later surveyors with proper instruments found it to be substantially correct in its representation of the cave's major passages and chambers. For a man who had learned the cave by walking it in lamplight, who had no formal education in cartography or surveying, and who was working from memory and observation alone, the map is a testament to extraordinary spatial intelligence and careful attention. Visitors to Mammoth Cave came to seek Bishop out specifically. His reputation spread beyond Kentucky. He was described by multiple contemporary accounts as not only an exceptional guide, articulate, knowledgeable, attentive to his visitors' interests, but also as a man of notable intellectual depth, who had taught himself to read and had learned enough Latin and Greek to converse about classical literature with the educated visitors who came to the cave. Bishop died in 1857, not long after he was finally granted his freedom. He was in his mid-30s. The freedom he had spent his life deserving came to him too late for him to fully enjoy it and the world he had revealed, passage by passage, torch by torch. Crossing after crossing in the dark bears the imprint of his extraordinary life in ways that are still being recognized. Franklin Gorin sold Mammoth Cave in 1839 to Dr. John Croghan, a physician from Louisville and the nephew of the hero of the Battle of the Thames, George Rogers Clark. Croghan was a man of education and ambition, and he saw in Mammoth Cave both a tourist destination and, briefly and tragically, a potential medical facility. In the early 1840s, Croghan developed the idea that the cave's constant temperature, stable humidity, and presumably pure air might benefit patients suffering from tuberculosis, then a widespread and devastating disease with no reliable treatment. He had a series of stone and wooden huts constructed inside the cave for the purpose of housing patients who came to live underground in the hope that the cave environment might heal them. It did not. The tuberculosis patients who came to Mammoth Cave fared no better there than they would have elsewhere, and some died during or shortly after their underground sojourn. The huts they lived in, or their ruins, can still be seen in the cave today. They are among the most haunting features of the cave's human history, small, dark structures in a passage of pale limestone, the remnants of a medical theory that was compassionately intended and tragically wrong. Croghan himself died of tuberculosis in 1849. The cave passed, under the terms of his will, to a trust that continued to operate it as a tourist attraction through the latter half of the 19th century. The guides who followed Stephen Bishop continued his tradition of exploration and deep familiarity with the cave. Among them were Matt Bransford and his family, an African-American family whose members guided in Mammoth Cave for generations, from the antebellum period through the late 19th and into the 20th century. The Bransford family's connection to Mammoth Cave is one of the longest sustained human relationships with the cave in the recorded era, and their knowledge of its passages was encyclopedic. Throughout the 19th century, various formal and informal surveys of Mammoth Cave were conducted. Army engineers mapped portions of the cave. Scientists and naturalists visited to study its geology, its biology, and its archaeological contents. Newspapers and travel writers published accounts of visits to the cave that circulated widely, making it one of the most famous natural attractions in the United States. Old journals from these early visitors make fascinating reading, even in paraphrase, since direct quotation requires care about provenance and accuracy. Visitor after visitor wrote of their astonishment at the cave's scale. They wrote of the quality of the darkness, a darkness so total that holding your hand before your face produced nothing, no shadow, no suggestion of movement, simply nothing. They wrote of the cold air and the strange sounds and the beauty of the formations. And they wrote, repeatedly, of a feeling difficult to name precisely, a sense of the cave's age and depth, a feeling of being in the presence of something that existed entirely outside the ordinary scale of human time and human concern. That feeling, it seems, has attended human visits to Mammoth Cave for a very long time. In the early 20th century, the movement to establish Mammoth Cave as a national park gained momentum. Local, state, and federal interests aligned, though not without controversy, and not without the forced removal of farming families who had lived on the land above the cave for generations. And Mammoth Cave National Park was established by an act of Congress in 1926, though it was not fully established until 1941. In 1990, it was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it is also part of an international biosphere reserve. Today, the cave receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. Guided tours range from accessible, well-lit paths through major chambers to more strenuous wild cave tour through undeveloped passages. Rangers and naturalists interpret the cave's geology, biology, and human history. And beyond the reach of the guided tour, in passages that are not open to the public and not fully surveyed, the work of understanding Mammoth Cave continues, as it has, in one form or another, for 4,000 years. The map that Stephen Bishop drew from memory in 1842 has been superseded many times over. The known cave today is incomparably more detailed, more extensive, and more precisely measured than anything Bishop could have imagined. And yet the spirit of his exploration, the willingness to cross the dark river, to find out what lies on the other side, to keep going, is still very much alive in the people who devote themselves to this cave today. Some passages he mapped are still walked by visitors. Others he explored have been extended by later explorers who found that what he thought was the end of a passage was, in fact, another beginning. That is the nature of Mammoth Cave. Every ending is provisional. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in the deeper sections of Mammoth Cave. It is not the silence of an empty room or the silence of a quiet night in the countryside, where small sounds still reach you: wind in grass, a distant car, the settling of a house. It is a more complete silence than any of those. A silence with weight to it. A silence that seems to have been accumulating for a very long time, undisturbed in the dark. Cave surveyors, the people who do the patient, meticulous work of measuring and mapping underground passages, often describe this silence as one of the most striking features of deep cave exploration. You become very aware of your own body in that silence, your breathing, your heartbeat. The small sounds of your equipment, the sound of your boots on stone, everything you bring with you into the cave stands out against that silence with unusual clarity. And then, sometimes, you hear something else. The faint sound of moving water coming from a direction you cannot quite determine. A distant drip, a low, almost subliminal resonance that might be air moving through a passage you cannot see. A sound that suggests, not proves, but suggests that somewhere beyond the wall of stone in front of you, the cave continues. This is one of the most common experiences reported by cave explorers working in unmapped sections of Mammoth Cave. The cave announces itself before it reveals itself. It speaks in the language of air pressure and humidity and sound, hinting at volumes of space beyond the reach of your lamp before you have found the passage that leads to them. Modern cave mapping in Mammoth Cave is a sophisticated, collaborative, and ongoing enterprise, and it is worth understanding how it works and why so much of the cave remains, despite many decades of effort, incompletely known. The Cave Research Foundation, established in 1957, has been one of the central organizations involved in systematic scientific exploration and survey of Mammoth Cave for decades. Working in cooperation with the National Park Service, Foundation members, many of them volunteers with deep expertise in both caving and cave science, have produced the detailed survey data that underlies the modern understanding of the cave's extent and structure. Their work has been continuous, methodical, and enormously productive. It has also revealed, repeatedly and consistently, that the cave is larger and more complex than previous surveys had suggested. Cave surveying is not a matter of simply walking through passages and sketching what you see. It requires precise measurement at every step. Surveyors work in small teams, moving through a passage station by station. At each station, they measure the distance to the next station, the direction of travel using a compass, and the inclination of the passage using a clinometer, an instrument that measures angles relative to horizontal. They also measure the width and height of the passage at each station, noting the character of the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Everything is recorded in waterproof notebooks or increasingly in digital devices, and later compiled into the three-dimensional map that represents the cave's known extent. In a wide, straightforward passage, a survey team can make good progress. In a narrow crawlway or a section requiring vertical rope work or a flooded passage that requires a diver, progress slows dramatically. Some sections of Mammoth Cave can be surveyed at a rate of only a few hundred feet per expedition. Others require multiple trips just to establish a safe route before any survey work can begin. The cave's hydrology, the presence of active underground streams and seasonally flooded passages, is one of the most significant factors limiting exploration. Many passages in the lower levels of the cave system are partially or completely flooded, their extent unknown because no one has yet been able to enter them. Cave diving, the exploration of flooded passages using specialized scuba equipment, is one of the most technical and hazardous forms of exploration that exists. The divers who do this work are highly trained, and they proceed with exceptional caution. Even with that caution, flooded cave passages present risks that are not present in open water diving. The ceiling is always directly overhead. There is no surfacing in an emergency, and visibility can be dramatically reduced by disturbed sediment. Several flooded sections of Mammoth Cave have been explored by cave divers, and some of these explorations have revealed significant additional passage beyond the water barriers. The connections between the Mammoth Cave system and neighboring cave systems, Rappel Cave, Proctor Cave, and others in the region, were established in part through cave diving and in part through dry passage exploration that eventually linked what had been thought to be separate systems. The most dramatic of these connection discoveries came in 1972, when a team of Cave Research Foundation members connected the Flint Ridge Cave system to Mammoth Cave through a previously unknown passage. That connection, made through a low, water-filled crawlway that required extraordinary determination to push through, instantly made the combined system the longest known cave in the world, a distinction Mammoth Cave has held, with its known length growing as new surveys add to it ever since. That moment in 1972 is a useful reminder of how dramatically a single discovery can change the understanding of a cave system. One passage, previously unknown, turned two separate caves into a single enormous system. It also raised, very naturally, the question of what other connections might exist, what other passages might link known sections of the cave to each other or to as yet unknown sections beyond them. The honest answer, offered by cave researchers without hesitation, is that they do not know. The geology of the region strongly suggests that the cave system extends beyond its currently mapped extent. The pattern of sinkholes and surface drainage above the cave, the behavior of underground water traced by dye tracing studies, and the structural geology of the limestone all point toward the likelihood of additional passages, perhaps substantial ones that have not yet been found or surveyed. Dye tracing is one of the tools scientists use to understand the underground hydrology of karst landscapes. A small amount of a non-toxic fluorescent dye is introduced into the groundwater at a sinkhole or other input point on the surface, and then detectors placed at springs and cave streams downstream monitor for the dye's appearance. When the dye arrives at a detector, it confirms a hydrological connection between the input point and the detection point. Water is moving underground between those two locations. The time it takes for the dye to travel and the manner of its dispersal gives information about the nature of the underground flow paths. Dye tracing studies in the Mammoth Cave region have confirmed connections between surface water inputs and underground streams that pass through parts of the cave system not yet fully explored. The water is moving through passages that exist, the dye proves it, but those passages have not yet been entered or surveyed. They may be too small for human entry in their current state. They may be flooded. They may be accessible only through routes that have not yet been identified. This is the straightforward scientific reality of why large sections of Mammoth Cave remain unmapped. It is a matter of scale, of physical difficulty, of the limitations of current technology and human endurance, and of the cave's own hydrology and geology. There is no mystery in the conspiratorial sense, no hidden agenda, no deliberate suppression of information. There is simply a very large, very complex cave system, much of which exists in conditions that make human access difficult or impossible with current means. The National Park Service manages Mammoth Cave with conservation as a central priority. The cave environment is fragile in ways that are not always immediately obvious. Formations that took thousands of years to grow can be damaged in a moment by careless contact. Cave ecosystems that have evolved in isolation over geological timescales can be devastated by the introduction of pathogens or disturbances to their food supply. The catastrophic spread of white nose syndrome, a fungal disease that has killed millions of North American bats since its introduction around 2006, is a vivid and painful illustration of how vulnerable cave ecosystems can be to outside disruption. For these reasons, access to undeveloped sections of Mammoth Cave is carefully controlled. Researchers and explorers working in these sections must follow strict protocols to minimize their impact on the cave environment. Certain sections are closed entirely to human entry in order to protect particularly sensitive features or ecosystems. These restrictions are not secrecy, they are stewardship. In recent years, new technologies have begun to transform the way caves can be documented and understood. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, uses pulses of laser light to measure distances with extraordinary precision and build detailed three-dimensional models of surfaces and spaces. In accessible cave passages, LiDAR scanning can produce maps of remarkable accuracy and detail far faster than traditional survey methods. The resulting three-dimensional models allow researchers to study passage geometry, identify structural features, and plan future exploration in ways that were not previously possible. Photogrammetry, the use of overlapping photographs to reconstruct three-dimensional geometry, is another technique being applied in cave documentation, complementing LiDAR in passages where scanning is practical. Together, these technologies are producing a new generation of cave maps that are far more detailed and accurate than anything available even a decade ago. Ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical methods can, under the right conditions, detect voids in rock from the surface or from within known cave passages, potentially identifying unmapped chambers or passages before anyone physically enters them. The application of these methods to Mammoth Cave and the surrounding karst is an active area of research, and while the results so far are promising rather than definitive, the technology continues to improve. The simple truth, the one that cave scientists return to consistently and without embarrassment, is that Mammoth Cave almost certainly extends beyond its currently mapped 400 and some miles. By how much, no one can say. The geology allows for the possibility of very substantial additional passage. Whether that passage exists in a form accessible to human explorers, and whether it will ever be found, are questions that the cave is not yet ready to answer. That uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is science in its most honest form, acknowledging the limits of current knowledge while continuing to push carefully and methodically against those limits. And in the meantime, the cave waits. Patient, quiet, and entirely indifferent to our curiosity, though our curiosity, it seems, is entirely incapable of leaving it alone. A man goes into the cave alone. He carries a lamp or a torch, or later a lantern, depending on the century. He goes in farther than he intended. The passage turns and turns again, and when he turns around, nothing looks familiar. He calls out, and his voice comes back to him from several directions at once, overlapping and softened, as though other voices are answering. He stands still and listens, and in the silence he hears something, a sound he cannot identify, a low, distant murmur, a breath of air from somewhere that should be solid rock. He comes back out, or he does not come back out. Stories of this kind have accumulated around Mammoth Cave for as long as people have been telling stories about it. They are the natural product of a place that is genuinely extraordinary, a place where the senses are disoriented, where the darkness is total, where sound behaves in unexpected ways, and where the scale of the underground dwarfs anything the surface world offers in ordinary experience. When people encounter something that moves them deeply and that they cannot fully explain, they tell stories about it. The stories grow, change, accumulate detail, pass from person to person, and eventually take on a life of their own. This is folklore. And Mammoth Cave has produced a rich body of it. It is important to say clearly, before we go any further, that the stories we are about to discuss belong to regional folklore, to the tradition of local legend and storytelling that has always surrounded places of unusual character. They are not historical documents, they are not archaeological evidence, they are not scientific claims, they are stories, valuable as cultural artifacts, interesting as reflections of how people have felt about this place, but not to be confused with established historical fact. With that said, the stories are genuinely interesting. The echoes of Mammoth Cave have inspired a remarkable amount of narrative. In certain sections of the cave, the acoustic properties are such that sounds seem to arrive from impossible directions. Voices seem to come from behind solid walls, and a person speaking normally can be heard at a surprising distance. Early visitors to the cave wrote about this repeatedly, and the experience clearly made a strong impression. It is not difficult to understand why. To hear your own voice return to you from the darkness ahead, softened and altered, is a disconcerting experience. And in an era before the physics of acoustics was well understood, it was an experience that invited supernatural explanation. Stories developed over time of voices heard in the cave that did not belong to any living person present, whispers from passages that had been checked and found empty, the sound of footsteps following a party of explorers, stopping when they stopped, starting again when they moved. These stories traveled from visitor to visitor, from guide to tourist, from local to local, accumulating in the way that ghost stories always accumulate, each teller adding a small detail, a specific location, a name, a date, until the story has the texture of something that really happened to someone specific. Some of the most persistent of these stories involve lost explorers, people who went into the cave and did not come back, whose voices were supposedly heard echoing in the passages long afterward. In most versions, these stories cannot be verified against any historical record. The specific people named, the specific circumstances described, do not match documented accounts of cave accidents or disappearances. This does not mean that no one has ever had a dangerous experience in the cave. The cave is large and complex, and in the era before electric lights and proper safety equipment, accidents certainly occurred. But the ghost story versions of these events have clearly been shaped more by the tradition of storytelling than by the documentary record. Lost miner stories are another strand of Mammoth Cave folklore. In the 19th century, the cave was indeed mined for saltpeter, the potassium nitrate used in the manufacture of gunpowder during the War of 1812. Evidence of this operation is still visible in the cave, the remains of wooden pipes and vats used to leach saltpeter from the cave sediment, the marks of mining activity in certain chambers. The historical saltpeter mining operation was real and well documented. But the folklore surrounding it has grown far beyond the historical record, incorporating stories of miners who were trapped, who discovered sealed chambers, who found things they were not supposed to find. None of these additions to the historical mining story are supported by the documentary evidence. They are embellishments, the kind that a genuinely dramatic and atmospheric place naturally attracts over time. Hidden treasure legends are perhaps the most universal form of folklore associated with caves, and Mammoth Cave is no exception. Stories of treasure hidden in the cave by various historical figures, Spanish explorers, Civil War soldiers, outlaws, and others, circulate in the region with cheerful persistence. The details vary enormously from version to version, which is usually a reliable indicator that a story belongs to the tradition of legend rather than to the historical record. Genuine buried or hidden treasure tends to have a more consistent and documented story behind it. Legendary treasure, by contrast, is infinitely flexible. It moves, it multiplies, it attaches itself to new historical figures as the times change. There is also a body of folklore specifically associated with the saltpeter mining era and the early tourist history of the cave that is more grounded in real historical events, even if the stories have been shaped and dramatized over time. The tuberculosis patients who lived in the cave in the 1840s, those unfortunate souls who came seeking a cure and found only an unusual and ultimately ineffective form of suffering, have inevitably attracted ghost story treatment. The remains of their huts, still visible in the cave today, are atmospheric enough in their own right. In the dark, with only lamplight, surrounded by the silence and the cool, damp air, those crumbling structures are genuinely evocative. It is not surprising that they have become focal points for stories of presence and unease. The cave guides themselves, Stephen Bishop, and those who followed him, became figures of legend in their own lifetimes. Bishop, in particular, was remembered by the visitors he guided in terms that bordered on the mythological. His knowledge of the cave seemed, to those who experienced it, almost supernatural. His ability to navigate in near-total darkness, to find passages that others would miss, to move through the underground landscape with a confidence and ease that seemed to transcend ordinary human capability. Of course, this knowledge was the product of years of careful observation, exceptional spatial intelligence, and genuine courage, not anything supernatural. But legend has a way of reaching for the extraordinary when the merely extraordinary is not quite enough. What all of these stories, the ghost voices, the lost miners, the hidden treasure, the legendary guides, have in common is that they reflect a human response to a place that exceeds ordinary experience. The cave is too large, too dark, too strange, too ancient to be entirely domesticated by the rational mind. Something in the encounter with it reaches past the analytical and into the imaginative, and stories grow in that space the way formations grow in the dark, slowly, over time, from small beginnings into something that takes on its own particular beauty. We do not need to believe the stories to find them meaningful. Folklore is not about belief in the literal sense. It is about the ways that communities process extraordinary experiences and pass those experiences on. The ghost stories of Mammoth Cave are a record of how thousands of visitors over 2 centuries have felt in the presence of this cave. The unease, the wonder, the sense of something larger than themselves, the slight and pleasurable fear of the dark. They are, in their own way, as human and as genuine as anything the archaeological record has to offer, and the echoes that inspired them, the strange, sourceless voices of the cave, those are real. They are physics. They are the geometry of limestone chambers and the behavior of sound waves in complex spaces. But they are also, in the hearing of them, something that reaches past the purely physical into the place where stories begin. That place is always worth paying attention to. In the rivers and streams beneath Mammoth Cave, in the absolute and permanent darkness, something is swimming. It is small, a few inches long, pale as milk, almost translucent, its internal organs faintly visible through its skin in the right light. Its eyes are vestigial, not completely absent, but reduced to small, non-functional remnants beneath the skin, useless in a world where there is no light to see by. It moves through the water with the unhurried ease of a creature that has never needed to hide from visual predators, because in this environment, visual predators do not exist. This is the southern cavefish, Typhlichthys subterraneus, one of the most famous inhabitants of the Mammoth Cave ecosystem, and one of the most vivid illustrations of what evolutionary biology looks like when a lineage spends enough time in a radically different environment. The southern cavefish belongs to a lineage that once had functional eyes. Its ancestors, surface fish that lived in the streams and rivers above ground, could see. At some point in the distant past, populations of these fish were carried underground through sinkholes or other karst features and became isolated in the cave environment. In total darkness, eyes are not only unnecessary but metabolically costly. They require energy to maintain and can be vulnerable to infection or injury. Over generations, natural selection ceased to favor the maintenance of functional eyes. Fish with reduced eyes did just as well as or better than fish with well-developed ones, and gradually the population shifted toward the eyeless form we see today. The same logic applies to pigmentation. Color in fish often serves functions related to visual recognition, camouflage from predators, or communication. In a lightless environment, none of these functions operate, and the metabolic cost of producing pigment can be directed elsewhere. Cave fish populations tend, over time, toward pallor, toward the pale, almost colorless appearance of the southern cavefish, which in a surface environment would stand out dramatically, but in the absolute dark of a cave passage is no different from any other color. This process, the gradual loss of traits that are expensive to maintain but no longer beneficial in a changed environment, is one of the most elegant and comprehensible examples of evolutionary adaptation in the natural world. It requires no exotic mechanism, no special force. It is simply natural selection, operating over a long enough time span in an environment that has its own very specific set of demands. The Mammoth Cave ecosystem supports several species of cave-adapted organisms, each representing a separate evolutionary story of adaptation to the underground environment. The cave crayfish, Orconix pellucidus, is another of the better-known inhabitants. Like the cavefish, it is pale and effectively eyeless, moving along the bottoms of underground streams in search of organic material to feed on. It is larger than the cavefish, more visible, and has been observed and studied since the early days of scientific interest in cave biology. Cave shrimp, Palimonias ganteri, also inhabit the underground waters of the Mammoth Cave system. This species is found nowhere else in the world. It is, by the technical definition, endemic to Mammoth Cave. Its entire global range consists of the underground streams of this one cave system. This makes it extraordinarily vulnerable to any disruption of the cave's hydrology or water quality. A single significant pollution event in the groundwater above the cave could, in theory, threaten the entire species. This vulnerability is one of the reasons that water quality in the Mammoth Cave region is taken very seriously by scientists and conservation managers. Beyond the aquatic species, the cave supports a range of other organisms adapted to the underground environment. Cave crickets, Hadonocus subterraneus, are among the most ecologically important cave-dwelling insects in this system. They divide their time between the cave interior, where they shelter and breed, and the surface above, where they forage at night. In doing so, they serve a crucial function in the cave ecosystem. They carry energy and nutrients from the surface into the cave, in the form of their own bodies and their guano, providing food for species that never leave the underground environment. Cave crickets are, in a very real sense, a living pipeline of energy between the world above and the world below. Several species of cave spiders inhabit the entrance and twilight zones of Mammoth Cave, feeding on the insects that move in and out of the cave. These spiders do not require the same degree of adaptation as the fully cave-dwelling species. They live in zones where some light reaches and where they have access to surface-dwelling prey, but they have their own ecological story. Bats are among the most significant ecological connections between the cave and the surface world. Multiple species of bat use Mammoth Cave for roosting, including the gray bat, the Indiana bat, and others. Bats are insectivores, feeding above ground at night and returning to the cave to rest and raise their young. Like the cave crickets, they bring energy into the cave system in the form of guano in substantial quantities, given the size of some of the historical bat colonies. Cave-dwelling organisms from beetles to mites to millipedes to bacteria depend, directly or indirectly, on this guano as a food source. The bat populations of Mammoth Cave have been severely affected by white nose syndrome, the fungal disease mentioned in a previous chapter. White nose syndrome is caused by a fungus called Pseudogymnoscus destructans, which is believed to have been introduced to North America from Europe around 2006, likely through the movement of cavers who carried fungal spores on their clothing or equipment between continents. The fungus grows on the skin of hibernating bats, disrupting their hibernation and causing them to use up their fat reserves before winter is over. Bats affected by white nose syndrome starve to death or die of exposure in enormous numbers. The impact on bat populations across the eastern United States has been catastrophic. Some species have declined by more than 90% in affected areas. The ecological consequences of these declines ripple through cave ecosystems and surface ecosystems alike. Fewer bats means less natural insect control, which has implications for agriculture and for the spread of insect-borne diseases. Inside the caves, less bat guano means less food for the organisms that depended on it, which affects the entire food web of the cave ecosystem. Research into white nose syndrome, into its mechanism, its prevention, and potential treatments is ongoing, and there have been some encouraging developments in recent years. A biological control agent, a naturally occurring bacterium, has shown some promise in field trials as a means of protecting bat populations. But the disease is widespread. The bat populations remain greatly reduced from their historical levels, and recovery will be a long and uncertain process. The microbial communities of Mammoth Cave deserve mention, even though they are among the least visible and least studied components of the cave ecosystem. Bacteria and archaea, single-celled organisms capable of metabolizing a remarkable range of chemical substances, inhabit the cave in communities that are still being characterized. Some of these microorganisms derive energy not from sunlight or from organic material imported from the surface, but from the oxidation of minerals in the cave environment itself, a process called chemolithotrophy, which represents a fundamentally different way of capturing energy from the environment than anything we see in surface ecosystems. The microbial communities of caves like Mammoth Cave are of interest not only to biologists studying cave ecosystems, but also to researchers looking for new antibiotics and other bioactive compounds. The unusual chemical environments of caves have favored the evolution of organisms that produce compounds not found in surface-dwelling microbes, and some of these compounds have potential medical applications. Research in this area is early stage, and the results are not yet definitive, but it represents a compelling connection between the ancient, hidden world of the cave and the very practical concerns of human health. The climate stability of the cave interior, that constant 54 degrees Fahrenheit, that steady humidity, is not only important for the organisms that live there. It is also what has preserved the archaeological materials discussed in earlier chapters. The footprints, the torch fragments, the mining debris, all of these survived for thousands of years because the cave environment does not vary. There is no freeze-thaw cycle to disrupt the sediment. There is no drying and wetting to degrade organic materials. There is simply the constant, unchanging cool of the cave, year after year, century after century, preserving what was left behind with quiet fidelity. The darkness of the cave, its most immediately striking feature to human visitors, is also, in a biological sense, the defining condition of the cave ecosystem. Everything that lives in the deep cave has had to solve, in one way or another, the problem of existing without light. The solutions are diverse and elegant: sensory organs that respond to pressure and water movement rather than light, metabolic strategies that make maximum use of scarce energy resources, reproductive strategies adapted to the unpredictable and often meager food supply of the cave environment. Life, it turns out, is extraordinarily adaptable. Given enough time and a stable enough environment, it will find a way. And Mammoth Cave has provided exactly that, an environment stable enough over a long enough span of time for life to find its way into every corner and cranny. From the blind fish in the underground rivers to the bacteria on the cave walls to the bats sleeping in the ceiling overhead. The cave is not empty. It never was. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, a research team assembles at the entrance to Mammoth Cave National Park. They are not tourists. They carry equipment, waterproof cases, survey instruments, sampling kits, laptops in protective housings, coils of rope, and the particular kind of quietly purposeful energy that belongs to people about to do work they care about deeply. Some of them are National Park Service scientists. Some are affiliated with universities. Some are members of the Cave Research Foundation, returning to passages they have visited many times before. They sign in, check their gear, confirm their protocols, and then, in the way that people have been entering this cave for thousands of years, they go underground. What they are doing today is part of a research program that spans decades and encompasses geology, hydrology, biology, climate science, archaeology, and conservation. Mammoth Cave National Park is not simply a tourist destination, though it is certainly that. It is also one of the most intensively studied natural environments in North America, a laboratory of extraordinary scope and richness, whose research findings have implications far beyond the cave itself. The science of Mammoth Cave in the 21st century builds on everything that came before it. The observations of the early naturalist visitors, the survey work of the Cave Research Foundation, the biological collections of researchers going back to the 19th century, and extends that foundation with methods and technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to Stephen Bishop or to the earliest cave scientists. Consider LiDAR, the technology mentioned briefly in a previous chapter. In accessible cave passages, a LiDAR scanner can be mounted on a tripod or carried on a specialized backpack system, emitting millions of laser pulses per second in all directions and recording the precise distance to every surface the pulses touch. The result, after processing, is a point cloud, a dense, three-dimensional representation of the cave passage, accurate to within a few centimeters, capturing every irregularity of the walls, every stalactite on the ceiling, every feature of the floor in extraordinary detail. When multiple scan positions are combined, they produce a three-dimensional model of the cave that can be navigated virtually, measured precisely, and analyzed in ways that physical exploration alone could never permit. Researchers can measure the volume of cave passages. They can identify structural features, fractures, bedding planes, zones of differential dissolution that might not be immediately obvious during a physical visit. They can document the cave's current state with a precision that allows future researchers to detect even subtle changes over time. For archaeological work, this precision is particularly valuable. LiDAR documentation of passages containing ancient footprints, mining debris, or torch remains creates a permanent, detailed record of the context in which those materials were found, context that is often as important as the materials themselves in understanding what they mean. A footprint documented in three-dimensional detail, with its precise position in the passage recorded, its relationship to other features captured, is a far richer archaeological record than a description or even a conventional photograph. Hydrology, the study of water movement, is another area where modern methods have transformed the understanding of Mammoth Cave and its surrounding karst landscape. Dye tracing studies, which we discussed earlier in the context of identifying unmapped passages, have been conducted extensively throughout the Mammoth Cave region. These studies have produced a detailed understanding of which surface areas drain to which underground streams, how quickly water moves through different parts of the karst system, and where the primary groundwater flow paths lie. This information is not purely academic. It has direct implications for the protection of the cave's water quality. If a surface contaminant enters the groundwater in a particular location, knowing the underground flow paths tells scientists and managers where and how quickly that contamination might appear in the cave. Water quality monitoring in Mammoth Cave is ongoing and systematic. Sensors placed in underground streams record temperature, conductivity, turbidity, and other parameters continuously, transmitting data to surface receivers that allow researchers to track changes in real time. When a rainfall event causes a surge of surface water into the karst system, the monitoring network captures its effects as it moves through the cave. The pulse of turbid, cooler water arriving at different monitoring stations at different times, tracing the underground flow paths in real time. This kind of continuous monitoring has revealed something important and somewhat concerning. The water quality in some sections of the Mammoth Cave system is affected by land use in the recharge area above the surface landscape from which the cave's groundwater is derived. Agricultural chemicals, sediment from disturbed soils, and other contaminants can enter the karst system through sinkholes and permeable soils and move relatively quickly into the cave's underground streams. The cave is not sealed from the surface above it. It is hydrologically connected to it, and what happens on the surface eventually appears underground. This connection has driven significant conservation efforts in and around Mammoth Cave National Park. The park's boundaries were drawn to protect the cave itself, but the hydrology of the system extends well beyond those boundaries into privately owned agricultural and residential land. Protecting the cave's water quality requires working with landowners and communities outside the park, a challenge that involves science, policy, economics, and the particular complexities of relationships between a federal park and its neighboring communities. The climate record preserved in cave formations is one of the most scientifically exciting aspects of Mammoth Cave research, and one that connects the underground world directly to some of the most pressing questions of our time. Speleothems, stalactites, stalagmites, and flowstone grow by the deposition of calcite from dripping cave water. The rate at which they grow and the chemical composition of the calcite deposited at each moment reflects the conditions prevailing at the time of growth. The temperature of the cave water, the amount of rainfall reaching the cave, the composition of the atmosphere above ground, the type of vegetation growing in the soils above the cave. When a stalagmite is carefully sampled, thin layers of calcite extracted from precisely dated sections of its growth, and analyzed using techniques such as mass spectrometry, the results constitute a detailed record of past climate conditions at the surface above the cave. By dating the layers using uranium-thorium radiometric dating, which is highly precise for cave formations in the age range of a few hundred to several 100,000 years, researchers can place the climate record on an accurate timeline. Studies of cave formations from karst regions around the world have produced climate records of remarkable detail and temporal range. From Mammoth Cave specifically, speleothem studies have contributed to understanding of climate variability in the eastern United States over the past several thousand years. Records that complement ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica tree ring records, and other paleoclimate archives to build a more complete picture of how Earth's climate has varied in the past. Understanding past climate variability is directly relevant to understanding current climate change. It provides the baseline against which current conditions can be compared, and it illuminates the mechanisms by which the climate system responds to forcing factors. The dripping water and slow-growing formations of Mammoth Cave are, in this sense, participants in one of the most important scientific conversations of our time. Archaeological research continues in Mammoth Cave, conducted by archaeologists affiliated with the National Park Service and with university research programs. The work is careful and methodical. Excavation in a cave environment requires all of the standard protocols of archaeological fieldwork, adapted to the particular conditions of underground sites. Sediment is carefully removed and screened for artifacts. The spatial positions of all finds are recorded precisely. Samples are collected for radiocarbon dating and other analyses. New analytical techniques have been applied to the ancient materials from the cave in recent years, yielding results that older methods could not have produced. Ancient DNA analysis, extracting and sequencing genetic material from ancient human remains or biological materials, is one potential avenue for future research, though its application to Mammoth Cave materials is subject to the condition of preservation and to the consultation and consent of descendant communities. Stable isotope analysis of ancient plant materials can reveal information about the diet and range of the people who left them. Detailed analysis of torch materials can illuminate the technology and preparation behind ancient cave exploration. Each new technique brings the possibility of new answers and, invariably, new questions. The relationship between the cave science community and the National Park Service is a genuinely collaborative one, shaped by decades of partnership and by a shared commitment to understanding and protecting this remarkable place. Research proposals are reviewed for their scientific merit and for their compatibility with conservation goals. Researchers working in sensitive areas of the cave follow strict protocols. Data is shared and published, contributing to the broader scientific community's understanding of cave environments worldwide. The researchers who work in Mammoth Cave, the geologists, hydrologists, biologists, archaeologists, climate scientists, and others who come here with their instruments and their questions, are part of a lineage that stretches back to the earliest scientific visitors of the 19th century. They are asking different questions with different tools, with a different understanding of what they are looking at. But the fundamental impulse is the same one that brought the earliest curious explorers underground, the desire to understand what is here, how it came to be, and what it means. It is a desire that the cave, vast and patient and largely silent, accommodates without rushing. There is always more to find. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. We live in an age of satellites that can resolve objects the size of a car from orbit. We have instruments that can detect gravitational waves produced by the collision of black holes a billion light-years away. We have sequenced the human genome. We have mapped the floor of the ocean and the surface of Mars. We have built telescopes that look back nearly to the beginning of the universe, and we do not know how long Mammoth Cave is, not exactly, not completely. We know how much has been surveyed, more than 400 miles of passage, a number that grows as survey work continues. But we do not know how much of the cave remains unsurveyed, undiscovered, unreached by any human explorer. The total extent of the system, accounting for all of its passages including those not yet found, is genuinely unknown. That is a remarkable fact, and it is not a source of embarrassment for the scientists who study this cave. It is a source of honest fascination. It is a reminder that the world is larger and more complex than our current maps suggest, and that the work of understanding it is never quite finished. What are the real unanswered questions about Mammoth Cave? Not the sensational pseudo-mysteries of folklore, but the genuine, substantive unknowns that researchers grapple with. There are several, and they are worth considering carefully. The first and most fundamental is the question of the cave's true extent. The geological conditions in this part of Kentucky, the thickness and extent of the cavernous limestone, the history of the regional water table, the patterns of karst drainage, all suggest that the cave system is likely larger than what has been surveyed. How much larger is not known. Estimates have been made based on geological reasoning and hydrological evidence, but they are estimates, informed, expert estimates, but not measurements. The cave has surprised researchers before. The 1972 connection between Flint Ridge and Mammoth Cave instantly added miles to the known system. Future connections, if and when they are found, could do the same. Flooded passages represent perhaps the most significant barrier to a complete understanding of the cave's extent. There are sections of the cave where known passages end at water, where the ceiling meets the water surface and the passage continues, submerged in an unknown direction for an unknown distance. Cave divers have explored some of these passages, finding that they continue beyond the water barrier and sometimes open into air-filled cave on the other side. Others have not yet been entered, either because the diving conditions are too hazardous, the passages are too tight, or the logistics of reaching them with dive equipment are too complex. The question of how the cave's known sections connect to neighboring cave systems in the region is also incompletely answered. Several caves in the area, Rappel Cave, Proctor Cave, and others, are known to be hydrologically connected to the Mammoth Cave system, meaning that water flows between them underground. Whether physical passages connecting them at a scale accessible to human explorers exist, and whether those passages will ever be found, remains open. The ancient human activity in the cave raises its own set of unanswered questions. The archaeological work conducted in the cave so far has documented the presence of people over a span of several thousand years and has characterized some of the activities they engaged in. But the full spatial extent of ancient human activity within the cave is not known. Have archaeologists found all of the areas where ancient people went? Almost certainly not. The cave is large, and formal archaeological survey of its passages is not complete. Future exploration of currently unvisited sections might reveal additional traces of ancient activity, additional torch remains, additional footprints, additional mining debris, additional evidence of presence. What those ancient people made of the cave, what framework of meaning they brought to their underground activities, is a question that archaeology alone cannot fully answer, and that oral traditions, carefully and respectfully consulted, may illuminate only partially. The gap between the physical evidence and the human experience it represents is one of the enduring challenges of archaeology in general, and it is particularly acute here. Where the physical traces are preserved in remarkable detail, but the living cultural context that would make them fully intelligible is separated from the site by centuries of displacement and historical disruption. The climate record preserved in Mammoth Cave's formations is rich but incompletely read. Studies of speleothems from the cave and its surroundings have produced important data about past climate conditions in the eastern United States, but there are periods and aspects of the climate history that are not yet well constrained. More extensive sampling, more detailed analysis, and the development of new analytical methods will refine and extend this record in the coming years. The cave's archive is not yet fully transcribed. The cave's biology presents its own set of open questions. The full inventory of species inhabiting the cave is not complete. New species, particularly microorganisms, but also invertebrates, continue to be discovered as sampling methods improve and as previously unexplored sections of the cave are examined. The ecological relationships between cave species and between the cave ecosystem and the surface ecosystem above it are understood in broad outline but not in fine detail. How the reduction in bat populations caused by white-nose syndrome is affecting the broader cave food web and how the ecosystem will respond over the long term is being actively studied but not yet fully understood. The hydrology of the cave system, the pathways and rates of groundwater movement. The connections between surface inputs and underground streams, the response of the system to rainfall and drought, is better understood than it was even a decade ago, but there are sections of the cave's water system that remain poorly characterized. The relationships between different parts of the cave system's hydrology and the ways in which changes in land use or climate above ground might affect water quality and quantity underground are questions with real and immediate conservation implications. It is worth being specific about what we mean when we say that the cave's unknown extent is a matter of natural complexity rather than deliberate mystery. There is a temptation, when confronted with a place as vast and incompletely known as Mammoth Cave, to reach for explanations that involve hidden agendas or suppressed information. This temptation should be gently but firmly set aside. The people who study Mammoth Cave are not concealing its secrets. They are doing the opposite. They are working with considerable dedication and often at personal expense of time and physical effort to understand and share what the cave contains. The cave is simply very large. Many of its passages are very difficult to reach. Some of them are genuinely dangerous. The work of understanding it is ongoing, and the pace of that work is determined by the physical realities of the cave itself, by the resources available for research, and by the conservation responsibilities that come with managing a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The unknown portions of the cave are unknown because they are genuinely hard to reach and study, not because anyone wishes them to remain unknown. There is, in the genuine unknowns of Mammoth Cave, something more interesting than any manufactured mystery could offer. Real uncertainty, the honest acknowledgement that here is a thing we do not yet understand, is more compelling, more intellectually alive, and more worthy of sustained attention than any conspiracy or cover-up. The cave is not hiding anything. It is simply very large, very old, and very complex, and we are still learning how to ask it the right questions. One of the most quietly profound aspects of the uncertainty surrounding Mammoth Cave is what it implies about our relationship to the natural world more broadly. We tend to assume, in an age of satellites and deep-sea probes and genome sequencers, that the inventory of the natural world is substantially complete, that the major features of our planet are known and mapped, that the remaining unknowns are matters of detail rather than of fundamental structure. Mammoth Cave reminds us that this assumption is not quite right. Here, beneath a landscape that has been inhabited and farmed and traversed by human beings for thousands of years, is a world so large and complex that its full extent remains unknown. If that is true here, in a cave system beneath a well-studied, well-mapped, well-populated corner of the central United States, what else might remain to be found in places less studied, less accessible, less well-known? That question does not have a frightening answer. It has a wonderful one. There is more to know. There is always more to know. And the knowing, patient, careful, respectful, honest, is one of the things that makes being human genuinely worthwhile. We have been underground for a long time now. We have followed the water down through limestone laid by an ancient sea. We have moved through chambers that took millions of years to hollow out, past formations that grew one thin layer at a time in the patient dark. We have imagined the light of ancient torches moving through these passages, held by hands that are now dust, carried by people whose names we will never know. We have walked in imagination beside Stephen Bishop as he crossed an underground river into darkness that no recorded person had entered before him. We have listened to the strange echoes and the distant sound of moving water, and we have let the silence of the deep cave settle around us. Now, slowly, we begin to make our way back. There is no hurry. The passage that leads upward is the same one we descended, and it gives back to you, gradually, everything the cave asked you to set aside when you entered. The silence begins to thin. There is a faint movement of air, not quite a breeze, but a suggestion of one, a gentleness that was not present in the deeper sections. The walls of the passage lighten, or perhaps your eyes, adjusted to the total dark of the cave's interior, are simply becoming more sensitive to the small amount of light that is beginning to reach you from ahead. The temperature begins to change. It is almost imperceptible at first, a degree perhaps warmer than the cave's constant 54, then a little more. The air begins to carry something different, not the mineral, stone and water smell of the deep cave, but something greener, softer, more alive. The smell of soil and roots and the particular richness of the world above. The light grows. It comes from ahead of you, framing the passage exit in a pale, silvery glow that seems almost impossibly bright after the dark of the cave interior. You slow your pace without quite meaning to, letting your eyes adjust, savoring the moment before the transition is complete. And then you are outside. The Kentucky morning receives you without ceremony. The birds are still singing, or perhaps they are singing again. It is impossible to tell how much time has passed. The air is warm on your skin, and the smell of the world is rich and complicated. Grass and cedar, and the faint sweetness of early honeysuckle, the clean dampness of dew still on the leaves. The sky is a high, clear blue, and the light, filtered through the canopy of oaks and maples at the cave entrance, falls in moving patches on the ground around you. You stand still for a moment and simply breathe. This moment, the return from underground, has been experienced by every person who has ever entered this cave across 4,000 years of human visits. The archaic miner returning to the surface with a pouch of gypsum blinking in the daylight. The 19th century tourist stepping out of the cave entrance with a story to tell and a letter to write home. The cave researcher, tired and satisfied after a long survey day, checking notes and beginning to think about dinner. The park visitor, quieter than when they went in, not quite ready to talk. What the cave does to people, what it has always done, is difficult to articulate precisely. It is not simply that it is impressive, though it is that. It is not simply that it is beautiful, though it contains real beauty. It is something to do with scale, with the cave's indifference to human time, its existence in a dimension of duration that makes a human lifetime, or even human history in its entirety, seem very brief and very small. The cave existed long before the first person entered it. It will exist long after the last person leaves. The water that carved its passages began its work 10 million years ago and has not stopped. The formations on its walls have been growing for thousands of years and will continue to grow. The blind fish in its rivers have been adapting to the dark for so long that they no longer remember, in the genetic sense, what it was to see. Standing at the entrance, looking out at the morning, you carry all of that with you. It is not a heavy thing to carry. It is, if anything, a lightening, a perspective that makes the ordinary concerns of the surface world seem briefly very small, and the extraordinary gift of being alive in a world this rich and this strange seem very large. The geology of Mammoth Cave is the foundation of everything else its story contains. Without the limestone laid down by an ancient sea, without the slightly acidic water that dissolved it over millions of years, without the karst landscape with its sinkholes and underground rivers and slowly forming passages, none of the rest would exist. The cave is a gift of deep time, shaped by processes so slow and so vast that they are almost impossible to hold in the mind. And yet the mind reaches for them because they are real and because they are the ground on which everything else stands. The history of human presence in this cave is a long one, longer perhaps than we will ever fully know. The people who came here 4,000 years ago, navigating by torchlight through passages we still walk today, were not primitive or simple. They were fully human in all the complexity and intelligence that implies. They looked at this underground world and they decided to enter it. They prepared themselves for the descent, gathered their materials, chose their light sources, and went in. What they found and what they made of it shaped something in their understanding of the world, shaped stories and traditions and ways of knowing that were passed down through generations. Even as the people themselves moved and changed and were eventually displaced from this landscape by the force of colonial expansion. That displacement is part of the cave's history too. It would be incomplete and dishonest to tell the story of Mammoth Cave without acknowledging that the landscape above it was taken by force from the people whose ancestors first descended into it. The cave now belongs to all Americans, protected as a national park, but the memory of its indigenous connection belongs specifically to the descendant communities of the peoples who knew it first, and that specificity matters. Stephen Bishop walked into the unknown passages of this cave as an enslaved man, and returned from them having changed forever what was understood about the underground world of Kentucky. His story of extraordinary ability exercised under conditions of profound injustice is also part of the cave's history, and it is one of the most moving parts. The freedom he was denied for most of his life did not diminish what he found underground. It makes what he found more remarkable, not less. He went into the dark and came back with knowledge that no one else had. Knowledge he gave freely to a world that had not yet found the decency to give him his freedom in return. The scientists who work in Mammoth Cave today, the cave divers and surveyors, the hydrologists and climate scientists, the biologists and archaeologists, are continuing a tradition of patient inquiry that is, at its heart, the same impulse that brought the ancient miners underground with their cane torches. The desire to know what is here, the willingness to go where the knowledge is, even when it is dark and cold and uncertain. The ecosystems that live in the permanent dark of the cave interior are their own kind of testament. Life found a way into a place where the odds, by any surface world reckoning, seem very long. Blind fish and pale crayfish and cave crickets and the invisible communities of bacteria on the cave walls, all of them shaped by the particular demands of the underground, all of them finding their way through an environment that is profoundly different from anything above ground. They are not exotic in the end. They are simply living, doing what life does, which is persist and adapt and find a way regardless of the conditions. The echoes of the cave, those strange, sourceless sounds that have inspired so many stories over so many years, are, at their most literal, simply physics. Sound waves bouncing off limestone in a complex geometry, arriving at your ears from unexpected directions after unexpected delays. But in another sense, they are something more. They are a record of every voice that has ever spoken in these passages, absorbed and reflected and ultimately dissipated. The ancient miner's torchlit murmur, the 19th century tourist's exclamation, Stephen Bishop's quiet instructions to a wide-eyed visitor, the modern researcher's clipped survey readings. All of it has passed through this air, all of it has touched these walls, all of it has, in the purely physical sense, left the faintest imaginable trace. The cave keeps nothing, and it keeps everything. Its walls are indifferent, but they are also witnesses to time, to water, to life, to human curiosity in all its forms. They were here before any of us arrived, and they will be here after the last of our questions has been asked. The morning is full and clear now. The mist has burned off the hills. The oaks above the cave entrance are in new leaf, the green so bright it almost hurts after the cave's grey interior. A pair of birds crosses the opening of sky visible through the tree canopy, moving fast and purposeful in a direction only they know. Somewhere below you, in the constant dark, the water is still moving. It has been moving since before there was anyone to hear it. And it will go on moving long after the last visitor leaves for the day, and the cave entrance is quiet, and the gate is drawn across, and the birds have gone to roost, and the stars come out over the Kentucky hills. drop by drop, year by year. Stone by stone, the cave that never ends continues to become itself, slowly, in the dark. And somewhere in its unmapped reaches, in the flooded passages that no diver has yet entered, in the tight crawlways that have not yet been pushed, in the chambers that are nothing but a movement of air and a sound of water coming from somewhere just ahead, there is more. There is always more. We do not need to know it all tonight. The cave has been here for 10 million years. It is in no hurry, and neither, for this one quiet hour, are we. The dripping water, the distant echoes, the slow, indifferent, patient, beautiful dark. Good night.